Hello, I'm making a game heavily inspired by Sekiro's fast-paced, parry-focused combat. My previous devlog showed the initial progress on the character controller and combat system. Now I wanted to work on the core systems that the enemies will be built on top of. Enemy variety is crucial in games like these as it keeps encounters engaging and challenging. So it's important for me to be able to quickly add in or modify enemies. The underlying system should facilitate an efficient workflow where I just import animations, configure components and have everything work together nicely. In my recent semester break of university, I wanted to build these systems for the enemies and then bring it all together in a new demo that you can all try out. Before I started on the enemies, I approved some pull requests from the project's second contributor apart from me. Thanks Soden/NenPotato. They did a bunch of bug fixes and started the implementation of the player being stunned after your instability bar becomes full. If you don't already know, I've decided to open source the project in these early stages of prototyping. Further down the line, I'll make a private fork once the production stage of development starts, if it begins at all, but the project files are public if you want to have a closer look. Reviewing their changes was also a good opportunity for me to get familiar with the project again, as it had been around 4 months since writing any code for it. After that, the first thing I wanted to figure out was how to import and use animations for the enemies. I had to refactor my attack component and made playing different attack animations modular, but after that, the zombie animations I implemented were done. However, at this point I started to see a few problems. The first problem was that setting up the animation tree was really tedious. I duplicate these attack animations so that repeating the same attack doesn't just cut and restart the same animation, and instead transition between the two. Setting them up isn't very efficient, especially since Godot doesn't support copy and paste in animation trees yet. Another problem was that any imported animations required certain scripts to exist even if they won't be played. Animations can call certain methods on scripts to perform actions. For example, at this keyframe, the weapon can deal damage. But if I import an animation library that contains animations I don't need and won't even play, I still have to include the scripts even if they won't be used. If not, the keyframes try to point to something that isn't there and it crashes the game. This clutters up the setup with unnecessary scripts. The last thing I noticed was that blending animations together is also really finicky. I blend the walk animation with the attack to make them step forward on each swing, but that means I have to configure all of this in code for each separate attack. Conversely, setting up the zombie animations was really simple as I didn't bother to do this blending. I didn't write any extra code for it and just used the same script to play the animations. I think I'll try to refrain from doing any of this finicky blending in the future. Doing the movements in the animations themselves seems like it would be more cohesive anyway. It's funny because in the first devlog I said I'd rather do this blending, but I've come to realize just how bad the setup would be. In the end, I got the zombie to work for the most part, so I decided to keep going and see what other problems I'd come across to get a fuller picture on how bad my systems were at that point. I felt that enemies that did melee attacks were straightforward enough, so I wanted to implement the systems for ranged enemies, and this is where I realized how bad my code base was. I imported some animations and that was all well and good. Setting them up was tedious, but not much can be done about that. But then the high coupling really started to show itself. Again, with the animation tracks, I import animation libraries for some common animations, but that also means I have to include the scripts for the unused animations. So, I didn't want this enemy to attack, block or parry, just shoot spells. But too bad, even the sound effects I had to include. Since the animation scripts interact with the animation tree, I also needed to have the different nodes and branches in the blend tree, or else the scripts would access parameters that didn't exist and it would crash the game. Furthermore, the components that implemented these unwanted animations still needed to be included as well. I hard-coded these dependencies into my enemy script when they should have just been modular enough to take in and out. I basically needed to include the attack, block and parry components even if I didn't want them. To make things worse, the behavior for the enemy logic when handling an incoming hit was also hard-coded. I could just specify there's a 0% chance of blocking or parrying, but the logic would still be there in the background, cluttering things up, and it's still not very flexible. And something else that really got under my skin was that this crosshair needs to have access to a backstab and dizzy component, which it absolutely shouldn't. It should be able to exist on its own without worrying about functionality unrelated to it. These components should communicate with the crosshair instead, not the crosshair accessing them. After seeing all of this, I realized how much I needed to refactor. I couldn't even finish setting up the ranged enemy. I only had the animation set up, but even that was left at a half broken state. I had this massive problem ahead of me and it was kinda overwhelming. So I did the next best thing and worked on something else entirely. I used this plugin called Beehave for the behavior trees that handles the logic on the enemies. I recently updated the project to Godot 4.2, but that broke the debug visuals. It looked pretty bad and it was starting to annoy me when setting up the enemies, so I decided to work on fixing it. I fixed everything from the nodes, the colors, the connection lines to the port icons. A weird thing I learned was that ref counted persists between running scenes. I would change the logic and values in the colors and I wouldn't see any changes. I thought I was going crazy. Turns out they persist and I have to restart the project whenever I changed anything in the ref counted script. I'm not sure if that's a bug or memory leak or something, but if it's intended, I guess it makes sense. Kind of, maybe. I also fixed another issue where the Beehave trees get removed from the debugger when removing the nodes from the scene. That's totally fine, but they don't show up again when adding the Beehave trees back. This was actually my first time contributing to an open source project, and it was very satisfying seeing my changes get approved. The issue had been open since October last year, and it was cool seeing the author get excited about the fix. With that out of the way, I decided to tackle on the refactor. I didn't mention anything about it earlier, but the first thing I did was refactoring my movement component. I took switching between programmatic and root motion movement out of the enemy and player scripts to just have it in this one locomotion component itself. The internal logic is also more unified. Next, I finally tried to fix my enemy setup, and this is where it got really bad. I didn't plan anything coming into it, so I basically gutted most of the enemy script's contents to make it more modular, but this was going too far in the other direction. Making it too loosely connected would have made setting up enemies more complicated and tedious. This is where I realized I needed to start planning these refactors out. The project has gotten big enough to where I can't just be gung-ho about changing things. I need to take a step back and consider everything. This is especially important as the project grows in complexity. I slowed down and thought about the code and things started to get better. I used a callback system for the crosshair. I made an interaction component that handles what happens on an incoming hit. I made components access animations directly instead of going through an unnecessary intermediary. I refactored calls to the animation tree parameters to use set and get so that they fail gracefully if things in the blend tree don't exist. I also made sure to use string names. They're fast for comparison since two string names of the same value are the same object. They're also what these set and get methods want in the first place, so providing them up front saves any unnecessary conversions. Next, I added a command pattern type of functionality to the main animation script. This script keeps track of all available animation scripts. Any animations now only access this execute method on this main script. They provide a name of the animation script they want, the method to call, and any arguments. This decouples the function calls in the animation tracks as it only accesses the main script. I don't have to include unwanted animation scripts anymore since the unused animations still have something to point to, the main script. And if for some reason they do get played, the main script safely handles commands to scripts or methods that don't exist or if anything else goes wrong. After that, everything was starting to come together nicely. I decided to rename my attack component to be melee component. I moved the successive attack functionality to the player's attack state as the enemies didn't use it. Next, I worked on making sure setting up new enemies was a smooth experience. In my unplanned refactor, I didn't realize that there were many aspects of the enemy that should be common between all of them. Of course they need health and locomotion, and each enemy should have functionality on being backstabbed and becoming dizzy. So I set up a base enemy to have all of these common features. New enemies can inherit from this scene and add in functionality such as melee, blocking, parrying, and the interaction handlers. With this base enemy scene, I re-implemented my regular swordsman and the zombie. After that, it was time to work on the ranged enemy again. So, similar to the melee animations, I made non-melee animations. But it deviates from here. I wanted non-melee actions to be fairly flexible, from spawning projectiles to performing status effects. So I made non-melee action effects, where each effect is responsible for doing anything. For now, I just wanted to make projectiles, so there's one effect that makes a single projectile, another effect that makes a sweep of projectiles, and a third action effect that creates a beam of projectiles. I like this setup so far, and dodging the projectiles is pretty fun. To compare, the melee animations specify when a weapon can and cannot do damage, while non-melee animations specify when an effect starts and stops. Some effects don't need to be told when to stop, like the single projectile or the sweep, although I think specifying how long an effect lasts should be handled in the code instead of in the animation, but that's for future me to deal with. I wanted to move on. I made sure parrying projectiles increased the enemy's instability and to interrupt the action effect once they reached max instability. Some projectiles still have some time to get to you, and this is a question for everyone watching. Should the remaining projectiles be destroyed once the enemy becomes dizzy? I'm kinda leaning more towards yes, but please let me know in the comments. And that was it, ranged enemy all set up. The refactored systems and this new non-melee system seems pretty good so far. After setting up the ranged enemy, I wanted to see how hard it was to set up an enemy that uses both melee attacks and non-melee actions, and it wasn't too bad. Again, setting up the animation tree was tedious, but other than that, can't really complain. Just like that, creating enemies became a breeze. The core systems are flexible and loosely coupled. Creating a variety of enemies in the future should be a painless experience now, but there's definitely another refactor coming in the future, I just know it. Next, I wanted to work on making the enemies be able to patrol around an area. Having enemies walk around instead of just standing still in the same spot waiting for the player to arrive makes the game way more engaging. I used a path 3D and a path follow 3D. I added a script that made this path instance move along the path in a linear way, have it oscillate between two ends, or move as a circuit. Working on the patrol code prompted my attention to the movement animations. It was pretty messy, and you guessed it, it required a refactor. So it went from these weird branches to this nice setup. I was even able to stop having individual scripts for different movement methods. I just have to specify which movement animations I added in the blend tree, and it updates everything accordingly. I can then specify which movement animation to use by calling the setState method. Going back to patrolling, when the enemy is far away from where they should be, I wanted them to walk a bit faster to get back into position, but to gradually slow down and match the patrol speed as they got closer. To do this, I got a min and max distance, a min and max speed, used Godot's remap function, and I got what I wanted. I had to fix the behavior for the enemy getting suspicious, but an enemy going from patrolling to suspicious, and then back to patrolling was really cool. Also how they go back to patrolling after being aggro. Patrolling was pretty much done, but it also made me realize I should implement enemies going back to their original position if they were previously just standing still, so I made that an extra step before going back to idle. The next thing I worked on was the player becoming dizzy after your instability bar becomes full. Nan Potato provided a great jumping off point, so thanks again for the contribution. I added the dizzy animation, some stars that orbit and move up and down slightly, a dizzy sound effect, a trail to the stars, and an animation to the instability bar. I added the stars, trail, and sound effects to the enemies as well, and it looks really good. I recently learnt about Fresnel shaders and thought it would be great for the shields. Making the shield the same color as the player looked fairly good, so I wanted to do the same for the enemies. This got a bit more complicated than I thought. Changing the color itself was simple enough, but changing the colors inside the animations turned out to be really weird. The changes would apply to the player as well, giving them a red shield. I tried checking the local to scene option, but it wasn't working. Turns out it was a bug. I had to manually duplicate the animation library and animations in the code to prevent them from being linked together. After that, I made a light appear whenever a parry occurs. It's just an extra little thing to improve the game feel a bit. You can also dodge now after parrying a hit. For the enemies, I added a new branch to the behavior tree where I can specify what the enemy will do after they parried a hit from you. For now, I just made them attack straight away, but I can see other behaviors such as dashing backwards and doing a ranged attack or something like that, like how Ishin pulls out the Glock on you in Sekiro. The next thing I worked on was having configurable values to the attacks such as health, instability, knockback, and the movement during the attack itself. Right now I've hard-coded values for these things, but they should be highly configurable. I knew this was going to be a big task, but I learned my lesson from earlier, so I made sure to plan this one out thoroughly. As a result, I came up with this diagram. I created 2 new resources, a damage attributes resource and a secondary movement resource. Weapons and projectiles are damage sources, so they both now have a damage attributes field. In a damage attributes resource, the knockback field is a secondary movement resource. I then refactored my locomotion component to use this resource for any secondary movement. So, knockback and movement during the attack can be configured through this. Each melee attack animation specifies a damage attributes resource for that attack, and so the attack component applies the specific damage attributes to the weapon. The projectiles, on the other hand, are largely independent, so I just modified the damage attributes directly on them. Both melee and non-melee animations can specify any secondary movement that happens during the animation. In the end, everything is configurable now and it works great. It was a lot of work, but having this diagram to plan everything out and to look back to was amazing. I'm definitely gonna do this more often now. At this point I was pretty much done with everything. I built the core systems for the enemies so that making them would be easy and everything would work nicely together. Now it was time to make a new level for the demo to see how this workflow feels. I decided to just copy the Hirata estate level of Sekiro just so that I wouldn't have to think about level design. Right now I just wanted to see how everything fits together instead of focusing on the actual level itself. Copying Hirata estate meant that I already had a semi-decent layout already established for me, so I could just make the level and drop in the enemies. The first thing I did was replay Hirata estate in Sekiro just to get a good feel on the gameplay and experience the level again. Previously I used Godot's CSG nodes to make a level, and it wasn't a great experience. Making the level was tedious and it didn't support occlusion culling. So I decided to try and use Blender. Before that, I made sure to create a layout for the entire level. I then used it as a reference in Blender, created the flat layout, and then made the elevation. The start of the next semester of university was quickly approaching and I was getting a bit stressed out. I had 4 days until I had to start doing schoolwork again and I was still working on the level. I also needed to release this new demo and then make this devlog. Yep, it wasn't good. How did I end up experiencing game dev crunch for a hobby project? Like, what? Anyway, I decided to just have the first bit of Hirata Estate, up to where you fight the first mini-boss. I only had regular enemies anyway, so the entire level would have felt pretty substandard, without any mini-bosses or a final boss either way. I was just kind of working with what I had. So I put in the walls, added some background structures, fixed the scale a bit, and it was good to go. Making these levels in Blender was much better than doing it in Godot. I'm definitely going to be doing the main structure of levels in Blender from now on. It's almost like 3D modeling software is pretty good for 3D modeling. Next, I set up the level itself in Godot. I added the navigation mesh, the occluders, the void areas, preparing the enemy sections, and adding in the checkpoints. The workflow between Blender and Godot is fairly decent. I can specify which objects should have colliders, and Godot automatically sets them up. The automatic colliders and occluders use a trimesh. Primitive shapes like box colliders would be preferred for performance, but quick iteration is more important right now, so I'm not too fussed. I'll try the pipeline that Michael Jared has been developing when I get to a more polished state and when it would be a good idea to take the time to set up primitive shapes for the colliders. It was also at this point where I started to think about the eventual art style for the game. I knew I needed it to be simple because art contributes just as much to the project's scope as the typical parts of a game. It needs to be undemanding enough that my lacking art skills can manage and so that development is straightforward. No surprises here, I'm going for a flat, minimal art style with low poly models for performance and simplicity. I think the hardest thing will be in making sure it doesn't look like a level prototype or grey box. I'll definitely need to sharpen my art skills to pull this off. This video on indie game art styles by Miz has been really helpful, and his tutorial on making a flat art style seems really promising. I think games like Monument Valley, Journey, and Thomas Was Alone are good sources of inspiration. Maybe even a short hike, both before or after the pixelated post-processing. If you know any more games, especially like Journey that is third person and has that really minimal art style, please let me know in the comments below. I've also taken a look at some art and found that some works by Tom Holgemet and Emiliano Ponzi are close to what I want to achieve. With this initial consideration of art style in mind, I decided to see how good I could get my game to look at this stage. I enabled fog and created light posts to create some contrast with the blue haziness. I also added different materials to create some slight variety in the colors of the level itself. I think the end result doesn't look too bad. Of course, there's still a long ways to go, but I think it's a good start. Making the UI and character model fit better would be good, and using post-processing shaders could be the key. Any suggestions on art or VFX are definitely welcome. The last thing to do was add in the enemies and set up the patrols. I also decided to improve the first level I made, the Ashina Outskirts clone. So I imported the model resulting from the CSG nodes into Blender and cleaned up the mesh. I'm still very much a beginner, so the topology isn't perfect, but it's way better than before. I also separated the mesh into different objects for occlusion culling and material selection. In the editor, I added in the new colors, some light posts, generated the nav mesh and occluders, sprinkled in some of the new enemies, and set up the patrols. I know I said it before, but I really like how the patrols ended up. The enemies look really ominous just moving around like that, but I think it looks kind of good. If you have any other ideas to make enemies more engaging, please comment them down below. After a few more fixes and improvements here and there, the demo was ready. You can download this new demo in the link in the description below. Let me know what you think. I'll admit that it's still pretty jank and there's not much design in mind, but the focus of the progress lately was more towards building the underlying systems. However, I'm always open to any suggestions or ways to improve the game, so keep that feedback coming. After that, I started working on this devlog, this script, and this voice recording. Okay, it's getting a bit too meta, I'll stop there, but that's the progress I've made in the last month and a half. It's decent progress, but it's always never enough, I feel like. Before this school break, I thought I'd do enemies and bosses, but boy was I wrong. Even with the enemies alone, I'm way past the deadline that I set for myself. It made me think more about my progress. It's been a year since I started this project, and it feels like a drop in the ocean. If I keep up this pace, it'll be at least 3 more years until I'll release something. This recent break was essentially 6 weeks of full-time game development, and since the beginning, I think I've done 6 months worth of full-time work in total, and this is where I'm at. Honestly, I have no idea if that's good or bad. People say comparison is the thief of joy, but I'm so familiar with Sekiro that I can't help it. Whenever I'm bored, I pick up my Steam Deck and fight some of the bosses again. When I play my game, it's kinda demoralizing. It just isn't there yet. But in the true Souls-like fashion, I just have to get good and improve the game. I do look at the credits of Sekiro every now and again to remind myself that I'm essentially trying to replicate what teams of industry professionals did over 3 years. FromSoft are literally the creators of the Souls-like genre with a budget of who knows how big. So I've got a vision, hopefully it's unique enough, and I'll try to keep the scope small. But for now, I'll continue to work on this prototype and keep improving the feel of the game. If it doesn't feel good in these early stages, no amount of polish will save it. This dev sprint was actually pretty fun. Everything is starting to come into place. I'll make sure to keep enjoying the process as this is a hobby project after all. The next things I'd like to work on would be to easily support swapping out character models, implementing creature or critter enemies to have some variety away from everything being humanoid, and developing the core systems for mini bosses and bosses. There's also a bunch of improvements and fixes I need to do, especially implementing most of your suggestions. And that's it for this devlog. It got a bit personal there at the end, but I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to play the demo and to leave any feedback, ideas, suggestions in the comments. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Peace.